More than 1,500 people were enjoying the concert that was taking place at the Jet Set Nightclub in the Dominican Republic. The event was going as planned. While some were chanting their favorite songs from the seats, another group was taking advantage of the huge dance floor. On stage was the already iconic Ruby Perez, a standard bearer of merengue and quite a personality among his compatriots. The man continued to elicit sighs from his followers. Despite being 69 years old, he maintained an unparalleled voice and a clear determination as an artist. Years and years on stage had given him vast experience that made him stand out among colleagues and critics. Even at that show, influential figures had come to see him. Politicians, athletes, and actors enjoyed the evening with a drink in hand and the company of friends. However, the festive atmosphere would soon be literally buried. At a certain point, some of those present began to point towards the ceiling with a slight fear in their eyes. Among the smoke and lights, you could see a dust falling from the high structures. What was that? The most prudent put aside their smiles and began to leave, moved by an instinct that told them a tragedy was looming. Unfortunately, they were not wrong. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What happened that night at the Jet Set Nightclub? Which personalities were among the fatal victims? What are the initial hypotheses in relation to the incident? What tragic precedents were there at the same site? To answer these and other questions, we are going to have to travel a bloody path that will take us to April 8th of 2025. The day the Jet Set nightclub collapsed. Before the shock took over the Caribbean nation, the Jet Set was synonymous with fun. The club, disco, and restaurant was opened in 1973 in southern Santo Domingo. Its owners needed only a few very successful events, extensive advertising, and a clear aesthetic pursuit for it to soon be considered the most popular place in its location. Those eager to enjoy the night went to its doors without hesitation. Similarly, artists, whether rising or established, began to see it as a very desirable display platform. Although currently the events were held at a different venue than the original, the popularity of them had not diminished at all, quite the opposite. Even, the producers of Jet Set didn't have to wait for the weekends to sell out venues. Evidence of this is that at a certain point they had started to hold Jet Set Mondays. Evenings that were held on that day and were headlined by the most notable stars of local music. Without going any further, one of the first Jet Set Mondays had featured one of the greatest representatives of salsa and merengue, the acclaimed Johnny Ventura. With each of these performances, the dance floors lit up and cheers filled the air. Word of mouth did the rest. No one wanted to miss the opportunity to experience the Jet Set. Naturally, when it was announced that Ruby Perez would entertain everyone on Monday, April 7, 2025. Ticket sales exploded. Born on March 8, 1956 in Aina, Ruby quickly made it clear that she had come into the world to fulfill her dream, and her dream was to be a great singer. She started in the orchestra The Pythagoras of Rhythm in her early 20s. And from there on, she hadn't stopped receiving awards, mentions, and the unconditional love of the public. It's not an easy task to stay relevant for more than 5 decades, but Ruby did it with total ease, confident that her perseverance, dedication, and commitment backed her up. Confirming this, at the end of March 2025, she had received the Sovereign Merit at the Sovereign Awards 2025. Knowing what would happen, that the award would turn out to be almost prophetic. The Jet Set website crashed sooner rather than later, and tickets to see the artist sold out. There were not a few who pointed out that a show worthy of anthology was about to take place. And that's what would happen, only for other terrible reasons. It was 0:40 in the Dominican Republic when hell began to break loose. Until that moment, things were not only going well, but there was the feeling of a charming night. Ruby had been delighting the audience with her classics for over an hour, and the applause was intense between songs. However, the first sign that something strange was happening occurred when small debris began to fall from the ceiling. Some even stopped filming Ruby with their cell phones to focus their cameras on the dust cloud that seemed to be coming from the top of the room. Today, those widely shared videos show the seconds before the catastrophe. Seconds later, the entire infrastructure gave way, burying those present. And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. What followed was a sequence worthy of a horror movie, a huge roar, more and more dust covering everything. Running, desperate calls for help. Those who were outside the disco were shocked, unable to believe what they were seeing. Multiple calls were made to 911, and soon the sirens added to the distressing symphony. The scene that the rescuers encountered was overwhelmingly disheartening. The enormous structure had fallen on many people. It was night, the smoke clouded the vision and resources were scarce. However, no one doubted what had to be done. Rescue tasks began immediately as the first media arrived in the area, when what had happened took on national significance. The relatives of the people who had gone to see Ruby began to gather around what had been the Jet Set Nightclub. Many carried photos of their loved ones, crying and repeating the names of those they sought. Lists were made with the names of the people who had been taken to hospitals, but there was another list that grew much faster. It was the list with the names of the people who had been pulled out lifeless from the rubble. The rescue operation lasted over 24 hours until Juan Manuel Mendez, the head of the operation, stated that there were no more reasonable chances of finding survivors. That announcement annihilated the hopes of those who had not yet received news of their relatives. Despair filled everything when the terrible official figures were known. Up to the moment this video was recorded, 280 people were counted dead. 189 were rescued alive and more than 500 were injured. The drama, of course, would also have other aspects. Numerous families were unable to access the bodies of their deceased loved ones. And there are numerous cases of individuals who, although alive, show serious symptoms of traumas that it is still unknown how they affected their future life. It is clear that the calamity will leave a wound of whose depth it is impossible to be aware at this hour. Among those who could not escape the collapses, according to the Dominican Republic Professional Baseball League, former Major League Baseball pitcher Octavio Dotel. The man had been rescued from the rubble, but died after arriving at a hospital. In turn, the league's spokesperson, Satoshi Terrero, reported that Tony Enrique Blanco Cabrera, another Dominican baseball player, had also died. Among the victims are also New York fashion designer Martin Polanco, an army captain, the president of the Popular Bank, along with his wife. José Bienvenido Ureña, an artist known for imitating the dance of the aforementioned Johnny Ventura, and Nelcy Milagros Cruz Martinez, who was the governor of the Dominican province of Montecristi. As it turned out, Cruz had even called the country's president, Luis Abinader, to alert him to what was happening in the nightclub. Was it the last time anyone heard from her? In fact, it is speculated that this last call, aimed at notifying the highest authority of that terrible event, Cruz would have made while already trapped under the rubble. Amid all the chaos, one question filtered through: what had happened to the singer Ruby Perez? What had been his fate once the show had been interrupted? Had he managed to escape? Around these questions, an extensive back and forth ended up brewing. Around noon on Tuesday, April 8th, news began to circulate that Ruby had been rescued and taken to a hospital where he was stabilized and receiving treatment. Some media even described how the rescue occurred. Ruby had been under piles and piles of plates and had managed to get them to him by using his enormous talent. Yes, according to these rumors, the man had sung, and in this way, the firefighters had been able to help him. The story was moving amid so much anguish, but it turned out to be false. It was never known if someone was indeed found because they started singing, but it is known that if someone sang among the ruins, that was not Ruby. The artist's representative, who had left the disco at the time of the collapse, expressed on Wednesday night, and I officially quote, "It's no longer a secret to anyone that last night in the early hours, the authorities managed to find the body of Ruby. Not in the conditions we hoped for, but as a fatality, as many suspected." In tears, the representative also recounted how that night, true to his habit, he had patted the back of his friend and client, wishing him a good show. The man stressed that the musician took the stage with great enthusiasm, prepared to please a crowd that kept cheering for him. The government will honor him at the National Theatre. While the gesture was well received by the artistic community and a large part of the population, the truth is that many others hope that this is not a maneuver by the most powerful to evade responsibilities. and there are reasons to believe that the collapse of the nightclub could have its genesis in a series of negligences on the part of the authorities. The first piece of information to consider when analyzing what happened is that in 2023, Jet Set had suffered a violent fire after a lightning strike hit the establishment's power plant. Those flames had been able to be controlled immediately, but many professionals have pointed out in recent hours that events of that magnitude tend to weaken the concrete. A group of experts was supposed to have been in charge of ensuring that the building was in condition to reopen its doors. Today it is suspected that this authorization could have been done with little responsibility or in response to private interests. In addition, architects who analyzed the videos prior to the catastrophe agreed that the structure of the jet set lacked the relevant number of columns. Considering that heavy mirror balls, large lights, and large speakers were hanging from its ceilings. Prosecutor Rosalba Ramos stated that although she understands that everyone wants to know the exact causes of what happened, for now the priority is to find the missing people. The owners of Jet Set on their part have said that they are cooperating with the authorities to clarify the facts. Pope Francis sent a message of condolences to the families affected by the tragedy. And Abinader decreed 3 days of official mourning, during which the Dominican flag will fly at half-mast. The Dominican Republic remains in shock, with its eyes set at the time of writing this report. In that place where rescuers, trained dogs, and large machinery are still collecting the damages left by. A sad episode that, from what is known so far, could have been avoided. However, what happened gives a new example that neglect and ambition continue to condemn the lives of innocents. Innocents who, in this case, had approached a musical show and ended up immersed in one of the most devastating events in the recent history of the Dominican Republic.